All right, thank you very much. I will be presenting opening pAMDora's box and unleashing 1,000 paths on the journey to play Beatsaber custom songs. Quick disclaimer, this is collaborative work. This is a collaboration of several people, by no means a one-man project. Many have contributed to a greater or lesser extent. Unfortunately, many are bound by cooperation and cannot or simply don't want to be named publicly. So just so you know, I'm not trying to monopolize credits. I'm just presenting collaborative work. Also, another disclaimer, we haven't reached the destination yet. This presentation is just mid-results. So, the backstory is, I bought a commercial gaming console, and I bought the VR headset for that console because it had an exclusive game that I wanted to play, but I also wanted to play Beatsaber. The game is obviously purchased. So the built-in song selection is limited. Custom songs exist, but unfortunately not for this console. You can create custom songs. There's tutorials online, and there is even AI, which you can feed in a song, and it generates a map for you. I didn't really want to buy another headset, either for PC or standalone, and instead I ended up buying a second console for hacking. You may be wondering why, but I tell you the reason is simple. My motto in life is, wer committet, muss auch pushen. Or in English, if you commit, you need to push. So, prior research, there were no major hacks for the device at the time, and then still no hacks for firmware high enough to play Beatsaber, which was the case when I submitted that. After I submitted and it got accepted, new major exploits dropped publicly just last month, and yeah, there's severe restrictions on downloading digital-only titles because to access the store you need to be on the latest firmware. So upgrading to latest is required, but then if you do that, you probably have all the bugs patched, so you cannot really hack the console anymore. There were some failed attempts, so there was some user space software hacks existed, at the time at least, for the latest version, but only in the compatibility mode for the old gen software. It was a really good entry point, but unfortunately lack of skills on my side prevented from finding bugs. Or actually, we did have bugs, but we couldn't even trigger them because of restricted attack surface, sandboxing, syscalls weren't available, which would trigger the vulnerable call path, so Also, the approach is not sustainable anyways, because the next upgrade would fix all the bugs, and then that would kind of prevent us from sharing all the efforts with other people, which would be really cool to do. So, demotivation kind of hit, and I didn't really want to continue this path. And I was thinking, okay, what if we hack hardware instead, right? Everyone and their mother are doing glitching lately. Mod chips were cool in the past and are still cool today, those without baggage at least. Others have successfully gone similar routes in the past privately. They didn't publish anything, but they did tell that they have done it privately. And I was like, okay, how hard can that really be, right? So at this point, we're going to switch to target because consoles are actually super expensive, right? But when the console is manufactured, sometimes the chips are broken. So instead of throwing them away, the manufacturer packs those chips, disables the GPU, and puts them on a desktop mainboard and sells those to still recover some of the money. And these are actually much, much cheaper, especially if you buy also with the broken boards. It has the exact same chip, it has the exact same ROM, it has a very similar boot flow. So what if we can hack this instead? At this point, a quick reminder, this is not a console hacking talk. From here on, we will focus only on the desktop board. So, the target that we have at hand is an AMD 8-core x86 64-bit CPU, which is the AMD Zen 2 generation. It has 16 GB of RAM. It can boot from SATA drives, and all what I just said is not relevant at us at all, because that is not the root of trust anyways, right? Yeah, if you buy broken boards, they're like €25 per piece on eBay. These are for my chip debugging friends. If we have some time at the end, I will tell you more about that. The real target here is the AMD Platform Security Processor. This is a Cortex A5, I think. I didn't really bother to check. It's a 32-bit ARM core inside the actual CPU. It takes care of hardware bring-up, for example, initializing the DRAM. It also takes care of the secure boot chain. And this is the real root of trust. This is where things get juicy. The boot flow is somewhat like this. You push the power button, some stuff happens, then the platform security processor is released from reset. The PSP ROM runs, it does some hardware initialization, it does some crypto initialization, it loads, decrypts, and verifies the off-chip bootloader. And when the off-chip bootloader runs, it loads ABLs. I think it stands for Agiza bootloader. These are like mini app snippets, and there's like, I don't know, 7 of them. And they do initialization, like more hardware you need. They need DRAM. They load the BIOS. And once that is done, control flow is redirected back to the off-chip bootloader and then loads like a secure OS for stuff like, I think, FTPM or remote attestation. And then the x86 is released from reset, and then the x86 BIOS runs. So the real root of trust is the ROM, but also this off-chip bootloader. So if we can glitch and compromise code at this point, that means we have full control. So running code in or after the boot ROM gives access to all the keys. It gives control over everything that runs afterwards. We can patch out all further security. That means we can inject custom code into the bootloader, into the hypervisor, into the kernel, into user space, and of course our target, into Beatsaber. This is not really patchable if you glitch, ROM stuff or compromise there. But how? How do we do that, right? That's what I was asking myself, and luckily there's a cookbook for this project. There's a nice paper, One Glitch to Rule Them All, Fault Injection Attacks Against AMD's Secure Encrypted Virtualization. Basically, this paper describes how to fault inject AMD CPUs. So what they do is they hijack the SVI2 protocol of a smart voltage regulator, which is basically some fancy I2C, and then make the board glitch itself by telling the voltage regulator to regulate down. Easy enough, right? The problem, the target voltage rail for this core that we want to glitch isn't really smart. It's not SVI2 aware voltage regulator. This is just a simple dump one which you can't talk to. Aside of that, black box glitching is extremely hard. The ROM probably deviates a lot from standard AMD CPUs, and we don't really have any info whatsoever. The internal state is not observable. So it doesn't make sense to get the ROM dump first to even see what's going on. This has been done before privately, but nothing has been shared. Some info exists about similar off-chip bootloaders, so the idea is, okay, what if we attack that first? It's a bit more chattier, and that can maybe help us to get the ROM dump. So the next step on our road is to get a ROM dump. Let's take a look at the boot flow. So the ROM loads the off-chip bootloader from SPI flash. It does decryption and SIG checks. The off-chip bootloader loads several ABL applets from SPI, which are signed but not actually encrypted. ABL does init stuff like DRAM and so on. And then the off-chip bootloader loads the secure OS from SPI, which is also signed but not encrypted. And at some point, x86 starts, and AMD Platform Security Processor stays in the secure OS. And now we're going to do like a detour and talk about postcodes. So post is the power on self-test. This is run during x86 boot, and different stages statuses are logged via postcodes. And if your PC doesn't boot, you can debug it. Early PCs print them on PCI. More modern PCs print them on the LPC bus. And the target board also uses postcodes, and the ROM has them, but it doesn't actually output them. You can, I think, internally access them via JTagger, but we don't have any of that access. But the off-chip bootloader does actually put them onto the LPC bus, so we can see the postcodes and we can figure out the different boot stages the board goes through. So again, off-chip bootloader loads ABLs from SPI, SIG checks and runs them, and the progress and status, like success and error, is logged via postcodes. And we can observe that. So the first thing we did is we built an LPC sniffer to get to those postcodes. I over-engineered this a bit and made this nice screens. We didn't end up using them because that wasn't convenient at all. We just ended up getting that from the serial log from Raspberry Pi Pico. All right, the plan is boot the off-chip bootloader from SPI, replace ABL, which is unencrypted, glitch off-chip bootloader during ABL verification, and then run custom code inside ABL context. And from there, we have a foot in the software already, and we can try to exploit the software from them and try to figure out how we can dump the ROM. OK, but how do we glitch? So the first idea we had is to smartify the voltage rail. So basically what we did is we removed the dump voltage regulator from the target rail, and then we bridged the target rail to a different unrelated rail, which did have a smart voltage regulator. And then we could do SVI2 injection, which would now essentially control two rails. One, we don't really know what it does, and the other one is our target rail. And then we try to replicate the one glitch paper and profit, right? So this is our glitch setup 1. We monitor the SPI lines and time the glitch based on that. We monitor postcodes and observe the errors. We compare postcodes to other resources and learn from observation. Like if you Google online, you can figure out, okay, this postcode means SHA error, ZIG error, boot success. If you compare it to the postcode output of a normal thing, or fail, and so on. And we never got a successful glitch with that. Because of a bootloader bug? What? Wait, what? So if you observe the SPI lines, you can see it reads the ABL0 header, then it reads the ABL0 body, and then it reads the ABL0 body again. Okay. So where should we glitch? Like normally you would glitch after ABL was read during the verification, right? But where do we glitch here? Should we glitch after the first read, after the second read? And then the question is, why is it being read twice anyways? So we were trying to glitch here, and we never managed to bypass the SIG checks, which apparently is a skill issue. Glitching here gives SHA errors, which we can see through the postcodes. And then glitching here, nothing really happens. And if you move it more inside the payload, then still nothing happens. And we're like, okay, this is weird. So apparently we have a talk-to bug here, right? The first read is copied into SRAM and executed. And the second read is hashed in flight with the crypto coprocessor and verified. So first attempts at exploiting this with the two-chip method. Basically, you remove the SPI flash, and instead you put two SPI flashes on there and connect it to the mainboard because it has nice headers. You proxy the chip select lines of both of the flashes through a Raspberry Pi Pico, and then you connect the Pico to the chip select line on the mainboard. You monitor with the Pico the SPI read access, and when address is seen, you switch the chip. Basically, every time the chip select is triggered, you forward it to the one chip, and then once you see this trigger address, you forward it to the other chip. So the first read from the first flash is our custom binary, and then the second read from the second flash is our original binary. And if we do that, we get custom postcodes. All right. Later, we have a production-grade exploit. You don't need two extra SPI flashes. You can directly inject the payload with RP2040. Basically, you put the RP2040 on the bus, and then you proxy the chip select line. And this is how the setup looks like. Just take a Pico and connect it to the mainboard. Really, the only thing you need to do is you take the original flash, you lift one of the pins, make sure it doesn't touch the mainboard, and then you solder to the chip select pin. That's the whole setup. And it looks nice and cozy like this. All right, so the entry hacks, we can replace arbitrary binary loaded by off-chip bootloader. The only restriction here is it must be smaller or equal than the original size. And we can exploit the software bug with a mod chip. Unfortunately, this doesn't work on console, otherwise we would have been done. And the reason is it doesn't actually boot from SPI. And it has an entirely different off-chip bootloader. Well, we need to continue our path then. So for the entry strategy, ABL0 is tiny. Maybe we can replace something else. Also, ABLs are a bit annoying to work with because they're sandboxed, so they run in EL0 while the off-chip bootloader runs in EL1. But if we replace SecureOS, it gives EL1 co-execution for free because that starts there. So what we did is we compiled our InSecureOS, which is code that is running in EL1. We can replace it as a fairly large binary, and it's also easily elevatable to EL3 because it's not even used. I think we didn't even end up using EL3, but you can just overwrite the exception vector and then trigger EL3 exception. You can be in EL3, but it's kind of useless because you don't need it. You can output postcodes to the LPC bus, and you can also read and write to the SPI bus. So you can also define magic addresses, and when you write to them, you can monitor those writes from your Pico, and then we build a logging primitive basically for like printf. You can also read custom data by reading from magic addresses. The Pico sniffs those and then injects custom data if you need to insert more data into the chip. We can also dump the off-chip bootloader because SecureOS lives in DRAM, but the off-chip bootloader lives in SRAM, and it's still there at the point in time when we get code execution in SecureOS, right? And this is how we got our first off-chip bootloader dump and how we could finally start reversing. All right, let's explore some crypto. So the crypto coprocessor has its own memory just for keys. It's called LSB, or local storage blocks. This is 8 blocks with 16 slots with 32 bytes each. But really, this is just private memory, and the slots can be protected, so you can no longer read out the keys, but only use them. Fortunately, this protection isn't very good. So let's get to slot hacks. Basically, protecting a slot prevents the CCP from reading it, but not using it as a key, which is kind of the whole point of the storage in the first place. The CCP address slots are addressed by memory type and byte offset, not index, because this is kind of just memory. And the offset in a slot does not need to be at byte 0. So if the key of a previous slot is known, we can increment the offset and use key bytes from different slots. Basically, instead of using slot 0 byte 0, slot 0 byte 1, and until slot 0 byte 31, you increment the offset by 1, and then you start with slot 0 key 1, slot 0 key 2, until slot 0 key 31, and then you have 1 byte from the next slot. Right? And now you have only 1 unknown byte, and you try to encrypt some ciphertext, and then you brute force the 1 byte that you don't know, and then you compare the ciphertext, and then how you get the whole keys. Right? Repeat for the remaining bytes. All right, CCP has readout protection. We write a super cool exploit, but it turns out all the keys are useless. Wait, useless, damn. Okay, let's continue with exploring the hardware more. No more keys here. So we can interact with the CCP engine. We can dump the key slots from the local storage blocks. All of them are kind of useless. Can we dump the boot ROM? Because this is why we're here in the first place, right? Nope. Unfortunately, the boot ROM is protected from reading by either the CPU or the CCP. We try to just DMA it out, but it doesn't work either. And except for that, for us, nothing else is really interesting in hardware. So we need to focus on dumping the boot ROM. So we got some hints from people who did dump the boot ROM before, and the 2 key hints that we got is, 1, reset the CPU while DMA at the same time. So apparently the reset is the important part, because we did try DMA. And then the other hint was, SecureOS might be too late. Okay, so let's go back to ABL0. But what we also did is we downgraded the BIOS to the lowest possible version for good measure. When I say BIOS, it's basically the contents of the SPI flash, which got a couple upgrades over the time. But if you Google this board and BIOS, you will find the right thing. This is why I just call it BIOS, even though it's technically not BIOS. Earlier BIOS doesn't even have SecureOS, so we kind of need to go for ABLs. ABL0 runs in EL0. It can read everything. It cannot write to EL1 protected memory, although it can read it. It can write to MMIO registers for system bring up, including CCP registers. I mean, come on, guys. So, ABL0 hacks. We put the CCP configuration into some memory in EL0. We point the MMIO registers to that config. We use CCP pass-through mode to overwrite the EL1 exception vector from the CCP engine, and then we get again EL1 code execution. And yeah, nice. Interestingly, a newer BIOS update fixed this problem because they don't map MMIO register to EL new anymore. However, they introduced a peek and poke syscalls, at least that's what we call it. And then you cannot use them to write to EL1 code or data that is blacklisted. Some MMIO devices are blacklisted, but not the CCP MMIO registers. You want to see the same exploit again? All right, the same exploit again. So put the CCP configuration in EL0 memory, use the poke syscall to write the CCP MMIO registers, use pass-through mode to overwrite EL1 exception vector, and then get EL1 code execution again. All right. Next stage payload. So the thing is, replacing able 0 is really, really tiny. So you want to have like a stage 2. And basically what we did there after we elevate privileges to EL1, we keep reading from the same magic address, which is SPI mapped. And then the RP2040 intercepts those reads and then pushes in our stage 2 payload. And then that's how we can run a larger stage 2 payload. All right, so the ROM dump strategy basically is we got code execution very early as we can with our primitives that we have. We can use CCP pass-through to DMA the ROM. Now the final missing piece is how do we reset the CPU without resetting the CCP or the whole board altogether? So we did a bit of research, and it turns out that there are some Chromebooks which have similar CPUs, and we're like, oh cool, so it does exist, we just need to find it. It mentions warm resets. We tried to reverse, but then it got tedious and we didn't really want to do it. So instead, we decided just to brute force it, right? So we just write FFFFF to the whole MMIO address space and see what happens. So if nothing happens, this is not an interesting register. If the CPU hangs, because we can do prints after every write, then it is an interesting register. And if we get the data aboard, then the memory simply doesn't exist. So it turns out most MMIO address space is unmapped, but there were like 2 hits which we found, and then we test writing just random bits to it, and the second match was the register that we wanted to find, and then simply by writing 1 to that, we could get exactly what we wanted. So how do we dump the ROM? So basically, we need to make sure the CPU is dead when the DMA starts. Otherwise, we may miss the start of the ROM. So what we're doing is we delay the DMA with an unrelated copy, which gives time for the CPU to stop. Because the CPU writes into MMIO for the CCP, be like, OK, start the DMA. And then the CPU writes into a different MMIO, OK, shut yourself down or reset or whatever it does. And we need to make sure the DMA doesn't start too early. So we copy unrelated memory somewhere else to delay it, and then we can chain a second DMA transfer, which then copies the ROM to SRAM, and then we just reset the board, and the SRAM content stays in there. We tested that, and then when we read it, when we boot the second time, we can just read the SRAM content and slowly push it over using our SPI primitive, and then dump it on the Pico and the USB serial console, and that's how we get the ROM. If you want to try yourself, this is the hash you want to be looking for. You need to remove OX 30 bytes at the end, because that is some random stuff which changes across the boards. But yeah, this is how the ROM looks like in SHA. Oof. ROM reversing time. Now we have the ROM. Now we can do the juicy stuff. And the first question is, are there any bugs? Actually, yes, there are. But we're not sure if they're exploitable, so we'll see. Let's talk about the boot flow, right? So basically what the ROM does on a high level, the entry goes to the hardware init, then it waits for external boot address, it does some key derivation, it loads, decrypts, and verifies the off-chip bootloader, then it calls a function which we call clear rex and stack, then boot, and then it jumps to the off-chip bootloader, which is mapped at SRAM address 0. What else can happen? Well, if we don't give it an external boot address, then we have some watchdog timeout, which will trigger an FIQ. The FIQ handler checks, is the source the watchdog timer, and there's really just one single source. And if yes, it does a system reset. OK, what else can go wrong? Well, if you give it some corrupt weird data, some header checks or SIG checks fail, then it will also panic. Then it also calls the clear rex and stack then boot function, but instead of jumping to the off-chip bootloader, it hangs forever. OK, wait a minute. So apparently this function is clear rex and stack, then boot or hang. And this is a bit fishy, right? Maybe you should take a look there. So taking a look at this exact function, it takes 2 arguments. The first is the boot address, and the second is a Boolean, which is true when it should panic and false if it should not panic. It clears the stack and the BSS, clears zeros all registers except for R11, and which holds the should panic, and then R12, which holds the boot address. It then switches on all the ARM modes into FIQ, IRQ, undefined, data board, and clears also all the banked exception modes. And then it returns to the original exception state that was there when you entered the function. And then it boots to the target or hangs. Can you spot the bug? Hands up, who can spot the bug? Fortunately, I don't really have time to wait. So let's keep going. So the problem here is that in FAQ mode, R11 and R12 are also banked. So if the function is entered in FAQ mode, then these values are stored in these two registers, then it switches into the FAQ banked mode, zeroes them out, and then it switches back into original state, which is still FAQ mode. And by that time, those two registers are zeroed, so the should panic becomes no, don't panic, and the boot address becomes 0, which basically corresponds to the regular boot flow. So how do we exploit that? Basically, any FAQ triggered not by watchdog timeout will cause a jump booting to address 0, because in the FAQ handler, it panics if the source is not the watchdog timeout. So the boot ROM exploit plan is stash a payload into address 0. This already is very tricky because it does have file system encryption. So that's a challenge on its own, but we think it's doable. Then you cause an FAQ for something other than the watchdog timeout, and then profit, right? You'll be like, you found a boot ROM bug, that means you got code execution, right? Unfortunately, we have no idea how to trigger an FAQ which is not the watchdog timeout. Thus, we don't know if this is exploitable or not. So we did not manage to exploit that. If you have any ideas, feel free to try. So unfortunately, no boot ROM exploits for us. We got to go back to glitching. So if we want to glitch the boot ROM, there's one really good target. And there is a branch into a main. In the main function, there's a branch which switches to alternate boot path. I think it's decided based on fuses. There's no decryption. There's no signature checks. There's very basic header parsing. We think it's some kind of test mode. So basically, if you manage to glitch at that point, you just run your payload, right? So glitch attempt number 2. We know the target, which is this value, source, trust me, bro. We can stash a payload into SPI or emulate sending it with the Pico. We can reverse engineer the needed payload format because we have the ROM dump, right? But now the question is, when do we glitch, right? We still need a trigger. So taking back a look at the boot flow, how exactly does this wait for external boot address work? So the real boot flow is you push the power button, the AMD PSP is released from reset, some hardware init happens, then it waits for the boot address. Some other component on the board sends the boot address and the boot command, and we got the hint here, I2C is used. And from that point on, AMD PSP continues to load off-chip bootloader from that address and keeps booting. So if we take a closer look at this mainboard, we can see that there's a CPU missing. But that's not the point. If we take a more closer look, we find a suspicious chip there, which is not the SPI flash. And just hooking up the logic analyzer to it reveals I2C communication. Boom, that's what we were looking for. It's some randomized IC, which we didn't investigate further. We did observe the following writes. It writes to A0, this value, FF, 8, 0, and then zeros. To the address A4, it writes 00 to 1, 000, and then on A8, it writes 3. So reversing the boot ROM, we can see that the registers A0 and A4 are just added. So the boot address becomes FF A2 1000, and once the write to the address A8 goes through, this is basically what triggers the actual boot. So we removed the entire IC. We hooked up the I2C lines to the Pico. We can manually send the boot command after pushing the reset button with the Pico. We also hooked up the reset button so we can reset the board with the Pico. We can delay, and then we can glitch. But how do we actually glitch? The problem is, our initial idea was to remove the dump voltage regulator. We bridged other way with a smart voltage regulator, SVI2, and make a glitch itself. The problem here is, this is not really viable for mod chip because we can't expect to turn on the x86 CPU afterwards, even if we succeed, and then be stable enough to run Beatsaber, because that's why we're here for, right? So for the actual payload, we need to figure out something else. So the idea was, what if we smartify the voltage regulator ourselves? So a quick voltage regulator 101. Basically, you have an unregulated input voltage, which in this case is like 12 volt. It goes through the controller, and the controller outputs regulated output voltage, which in our case is 0.8 volt. Then it goes into a sampling circuit, which gives a feedback signal into a comparator circuit, and that compares it to a reference voltage, which is internally generated, and in this case is 0.7 volt. And the comparator gives an error signal to the controller, right? So the sampling circuit is basically voltage divider. Input is 0.8 volt, output 0.7 volt. And the output voltage is adjusted such that the feedback voltage is equal to the reference voltage. So if the output voltage drops, for example, if the SoC consumes more power, then the feedback voltage also drops, and then the controller increases output until feedback equals reference. If output voltage rises, for example, then the SoC computes less power, the controller decreases the output. This is basically how the voltage regulator works. So what if we lie in the feedback loop, right? What if we add fake voltage to the feedback, then the real output voltage would drop, right? If we subtract voltage, then the feedback, the real output would rise. So we built a mod chip to do exactly that. This is the schematic, and we use basically an op-amp. We use OPA 354. I know I missed the chance to use OPA 334, but this is the better chip. You can look it up later. This is not too important. So basically, how to connect the mod chip. So this is the voltage divider circuit. So we inject our mod chip to the voltage divider. We cut the trace between Vout and R1. And then we put the mod chip in between. So for the voltage regulator mod, increasing feedback voltage reduces the output voltage. And that essentially allows us to undervolt the chip. We get a fine-grained control over the exact voltage, because the more we add, the more it drops, and we can precisely regulate that. Going too fast, too low trips the voltage regulator, but if you just don't do that, then there's no limits if you go slow enough. Well, until the SoC dies. This is how you install the voltage regulator mod. You have one big ground, then you cut one trace, then you have one side of the trace is the VREG, and then the other side of the trace is the Vout. And this is how it looks like if you put on the voltage regulator mod, and at that point, look at me, I'm the voltage regulator now. So for the voltage injection, regulating voltage rail works fairly well. Caps are still in place, and we don't actually want to remove them, because we want to still play Beatsaber afterwards. So the discharge is super slow. Rising voltage, on the other hand, is actually super fast, and we have a fine-grained control over the voltage rail, but, well, with the caps interfering. That was a good point in time to take out my good scope, which I barely used, and you can take a look and see how we can manipulate the voltage rails. So we have like step down the voltage and not trip the voltage regulator, and then we can step it up. We can have custom shapes. We can also do shapes like this, more nicer slides to go down, nicer step ups. We can also do custom shapes to some degree. We can also do really steep rises with like mini steps that you barely see. And my strategy here was to go down, have the caps which kind of slow it down the discharge until you reach a self-undervolt voltage. Once there, you do a small dip to the critical level, which is the actual glitch, and from there you have a steep rise with some overshoot. I don't know if that's necessary, but it looks cool. And this is how I was trying to glitch the chip. If you run test code in SRAM, which we could do, it successfully glitches it. So basically the code is we have two nested for loops which run 5,000 times and just increment the counter, and at the end you print the values. And as you can see on the right, the 1, 2, 3rd column should be 25 million, or 25 and 000. And as you can see, this is not. And the reason this is not is because we inject a glitch and make something happen that the value changes, right? So this basically proves that we can successfully glitch. To do that, a very weak glitch is needed, unlike the one I showed before. That was a very strong glitch. But we couldn't actually glitch the ROM. No observer glitch unless the glitch is like 10 times stronger than what we needed to glitch code an SRAM. So the observations to the glitch are: memory bus is likely the victim. Load and stores are super easy targets. Also, instruction fetches from SRAM are also likely very vulnerable. So if it fetches an instruction and we corrupt something in the bus, this is essentially how this glitch skips or changes an instruction. The problem is the ROM is much, much, much more robust. You can still glitch load and store because that still accesses the memory bus from SRAM, but non-memory instructions are harder to glitch because the ROM bus itself is much more robust. In our case, the glitch target is to skip a branch equal, or alternatively, we could corrupt a TST or UBFX instruction or one single push or pop. The problem with the push or pop is that not only the target value is going to be pushed and popped from a stack, but also the link register and the PC. And if that gets corrupted, also might corrupt the flow. So we didn't figure this out yet, unfortunately. My theory why this doesn't work is because we go down with the voltage, and at some point we reached a level where the SRAM bus is glitched, but the ROM glitched is much further down. And then if we go down, 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 sometimes we probably reach the ROM glitching, but the area where we stay in the SRAM glitching gets too long, such that an unrelated memory instruction like a load, a store, push, pop, always gets corrupted during that time window. And the reason for that is because the caps are still there and the discharge is slow. We were thinking of combining this technique with the crowbar mod only to discharge the caps faster, but we haven't tried it yet. Sorry, no Beatsaber custom songs yet. At least that's what I would have said like 2 days ago, because we did figure it out. But before we get there, we open sourced a couple things. We have the ROM dumping payload, which is basically the firmware for Raspberry Pi Pico. We have the mod chip PCB, which you can also put a Pico on and then buy the components and try the glitching itself. We also have the mod chip firmware, where you can see some of our glitch attempts. And then we have some nice X-ray pictures of the main board. And on my T-shirt, I'm wearing actually one of those X-ray images. Yeah, so you can take a look and play around. And before we get to the Q&A, we actually have time for bonus slides. So, bonus one, how do we get to all the keys? As mentioned before, we dump the keys, but that are kind of useless. And the reason is because the slot with the juicy key gets overwritten, so the key, the one that decrypts the off-chip bootloader, it gets overwritten with a different key before the control flow is transferred to the off-chip bootloader. So when we run the off-chip bootloader, we no longer have the key in the slot, which actually decrypts the off-chip bootloader, so we can't actually decrypt all the other off-chip bootloaders. We have the ROM, so we can reverse the key derivation algorithm, and really the only missing part is fuses. If we manage to do the glitch, then this is for free, because we can access fuses, we can access keys, and we're good. If we don't succeed glitching, we can try to do something else. So I've heard people manage to do some other crazy hacks and re-enable the fuses. This is kind of not a priority, because I don't really need that to play the Beatsaber. But another cool thing to just have would be try to read them from hardware. And back to the beginning, you might be wondering, why do you need so many boards? You can see 4 boards here. We actually have like 3 more. But these boards, those are for my friends who remove the chip and make some nice pictures of the main board, also the X-ray board, X-ray of the main board. And they cut up and polish it down, this chip. And then they cook it in acid and take some nice pictures of it. And then they put it onto a microscope and then take some even nicer pictures of it. And then if we zoom to the right, This is maybe where the platform security processor is. Unfortunately, I asked them to do that for me, and I don't pay them money, so this is not a high priority for them, and they didn't manage to get it in time. Also, a couple days ago, their equipment broke, so unfortunately, they didn't actually manage to extract the fuses yet. They have a general idea where the ROM could be, because you can theoretically also just optically read it out. But yeah, that could be an option to get to the fuses. In this particular case, the console fuses, consoles are fused differently and uniquely, so getting the desktop kit fuses is really just useless. But if you maybe want to give them a console chip and ask them for some services, these are my friends. But the actual question is, when ETA custom songs? Because this is why we're here. This is why we're doing this. There has been some updates on the Beatsaber thing. After the announcement of the talk, a lot happened in the console hacking scene. There were multiple exploits, hacks, jailbreaks released, including firmware high enough to play Beatsaber and compatible with my console. So my theory is that people got scared that their bug's going to be useless after seeing the announcement, and it just dropped everything, which works out nicely for me, so I kind of achieved my goal. So I can jailbreak my console with public stuff and then work on the last missing piece, and we did. The roadmap was, first I learned to sing, then I recorded an original song. I run through the Beatsage AI to generate a Beatsaber map. I jailbroke the console with Beatsaber installed. Then you dump and decrypt the Beatsaber. You convert the custom map from the Beatsaber from JSON into some binary format compatible with the console. You replace some existing song with the on song by like binary patching. You reinstall the patched game, and the goal is achieved. And the map is available to download right here, and there's also a YouTube video of me playing it. Don't complain that I suck. I had to record the demo yesterday night. Now we have time for some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your talk. We have now time for questions, as you said. We have 6 microphones here in the room, so please gather there and start your questions.
First of all, are there questions from the internet? The Signal Angel's microphone is not working. Oh, now we have connection to the internet.
High tech, yes. Yes, the internet has a question. So given the AMD PSP has been used in so many different CPUs, how many of the techniques and approaches you took are transferable? And are you aware of others using these or similar approaches for other AMD chips as well?
So I don't know exactly what CPUs are affected, because there is this one CPU which runs Beatsaber, which is what I care about. But I would think that they share a lot of code, and you can potentially apply some of the exploits, bugs, strategies also on other AMD CPUs. That wouldn't surprise me. But I have not looked into any other CPUs other than this one.
Microphone 2.
Thanks for your talk. You mentioned having to reset the CPU to get the MA to dump the ROM. Do you know what the relation is? Why does the CPU need to be in reset for that?
So apparently there's like some kind of mechanism which locks down the ROM from being read after the ROM is done executing. And by doing some warm resets, there's a way to re-enable the ROM being active, but the CPU cannot execute anything outside of the ROM, and the ROM still be there, so it just locks itself out. That's some protection.
Okay, thank you.
And one last question from microphone 3.
Hi, nice talk. As you mentioned, you got some hint from the previous research that they have dumped the boot ROM from these kind of AMD's chip. Is this the way they dump the boot ROM from the 4800S?
I have not been shared any details on how they dumped. All I've heard is we did some glitching, we did some hacks, but people didn't really share the techniques.
Okay, thank you.